The Arizona Center for the Book presents Southwest Book Chats, a series of conversations about selected titles from the Pima County Public Library's Southwest Books of the Year. Join us as we discuss 6 books that address the challenges and the triumphs of our communities. We will explore, celebrate, and share stories that make Arizona's literary landscape one of the richest in the country. This project is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives and Public Records, a division of the Arizona Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. Tripas by Brandon Som is featured in Pima County Public Library's 2024 edition of Southwest Books of the Year. Reviewer Estela Gonzalez writes, Brandon Som unflinchingly looks at the politics of language and place through a family history made up not only of American but also Mexican and Chinese immigrant communities in Arizona. Som's effortless twining of Chinese, English, and Spanish forms the guts of this text, which connects words, lines, and verses to form a literary body that carries history, language, pain, and sometimes humor. Mari Herreras is a poet, journalist, mother, and fifth-generation Tucsonan. Herreras, former staff writer and managing editor of the Tucson Weekly, has published her poetry in several anthologies and regional journals. At Grande and Congress is her debut collection published by R&R Press. Herreras writes about family, the tender complexities of identity and being Chicana, and life in a gentrifying desert city. Yahm Levin is the Arizona Collection and Reading Arizona librarian for the State of Arizona Research Library. She also manages Reading Arizona, a free platform for ebooks and e-audiobooks about Arizona for Arizonans. Her interests include the ways that first and second generation immigrant identity is negotiated in place, foodways, Jewish culture and history, and exploring as much of the world as she possibly can.
Hey, yeah, let's talk about some poetry. Yeah, I'm so excited. Yeah, so what was your like first impression? Did you know his poetry before
You know,
this?
I didn't. I didn't know his poetry before, and I was in 2 panels with him for the Tucson Festival of Books, and that was the first time before the festival, when I was looking at the panels, I looked at his writing and looked at Tripas, and um, but it was pretty wonderful, actually, the panels and hearing him read. But also, the first panel, his he had a large group of his Chinese Phoenix relatives that had driven down for the reading, and it was just so cool to see them out there beaming at him, and it was pretty cool. He's so young, at least to me. I mean, everyone seems so young now. Um, but it was pretty wonderful to see them out there and really love being there for him.
That's so lovely. Well, and it's so important too, I think, especially someone who's just, I mean, this is his first published collection, right? So just to start out to have that
Mhm.
family support is so important, and especially I think because it seems like his who his family is such a it's so interesting, right? Like, and it's so um maybe not what you would expect to find in a place like Arizona or Phoenix in particular, because I don't think that people think about Phoenix as quite as diverse as it is, and Arizona as a state. But it is. I mean,
Right.
because we have such a long history of immigration and people coming and going and indigenous people and just this constant movement throughout the state, in and out. It's just a very porous state from any border you look at, no matter where. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
so interesting.
Yeah, I thought of Stella Pope Duarte as well because of her Irish background and her, obviously Mexican American
Yeah.
too. But that was I've heard her in person talk about her family life and the immigrants that she came from in Phoenix. But there's there's also this thing I think sometimes when I looked at his family, Brandon's family, was that I think when you write about family and you come from these backgrounds, sometimes it's not always really it's not always really welcomed, or it's not always like celebrated. Sometimes it's like, are
Right.
you airing our dirty laundry, or why are you talking about this? So I think it
Yeah.
depends on your family's point of view. Not all families are like really help think it's cool that you're writing about them, and um so
Yeah.
that's one of the things I thought was just so great to see
Yeah.
about there too, for that reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's also sometimes shame associated with having immigrant parents. My parents are immigrants, and so I'm the first American in my family, American born in my family, and um, you know, trying to navigate multiple identities and trying to find that sweet spot between wanting to completely assimilate into broader American mainstream culture that is very like specific to where you are, right? Uh, versus trying to your my parents at least tried to really instill like be like do not forget our culture, you must speak our language, you cannot speak English at home, in a very intense way, which it took it took me years to figure out how to find that balance, and it's still tricky. And I think there's a lot of shame in that, because you have to deal with poverty and exclusion, and accents are so complicated too, and being able to communicate with the outside world, and then you have your little community, and but I think that I didn't find any shame in the poems. It was really this like just these, even the harder poems, it all felt like uh he was just cradling, his family and his history, and even growing up in Phoenix, just cradling it and really loving it and cherishing everything. And it's very beautiful. Very
I think
beautiful.
that there's one thing that we can count on for these kinds of stories being brought to light, or these things shared, or is that you can count on poets to not necessarily to kind of pick at that shame, or to
Mhm.
whatever else could be um what other ways a family could family trauma, how family trauma carries itself, and not wanting to share those stories, or not wanting to really, why are you talking about that, that comes up,
Mhm.
why are you talking about this? But we'd always count on poets to be like, nah, this has been on my mind quite a bit, we're gonna talk about this. Um, and that's the great thing too. It's like just the fact that his detail too, with his grandfather's store, and the grandmother who was working for,
Was it a battery plant, I think? Or
yeah,
yeah, or the circuits. Circuits. That's
right,
that's a big theme.
yeah,
Yeah,
right,
circuits. Yeah.
right. And then getting sick because of that
Hmm.
work too. But just all the detail, and I think that, and I'm sure, Jan, you can relate to this with your own family's story history, is that I think what, as kids, you take in the family mythology, like you hear the stories, you're driving with your grandparents or your mom or dad or whatever, and you're given little treats of these stories, and for some people they really hang on to those, and I feel like Brandon definitely did, and gifted us with being able to retell these situations, or these stories, or these things that he remembered when hanging out with these people, and watching them live a life that was not easy, obviously,
Yeah.
but I always, when people are like, "Oh, that's really tough," or I'm like, "Well, what can you do except go forward, right? Keep moving."
Right. Yep.
And I think like his grandmother, what a great example of that, like
Mhm.
getting up, driving to work, going,
Yep.
keep moving. And I think luckily for them, they have this poet in the family who can take these hard-worn uh, lives and repurpose them and give them to us at beautiful, really beautiful people, beautiful situations um, that are now captured in this book.
Yeah. 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 And I think so two things I thought of while you were talking. One is that I think almost every poem there's this beautiful, besides like the actual like what what is happening, because there's always something happening. Somebody's fiddling with something, someone is creating something, whatever. But it's almost like I could really visualize it in my head too. Like there's a really beautiful visual component to almost I think every poem, which um I don't know that you always get that with poems. I mean, because poetry is such a dynamic genre of expression, of literary expression, right? So you can do, it could be just feelings, it could be just a place, whatever, and it's a really beautiful balance, an intriguing balance. It's like almost every poem is a little vignette, but still a poem, but still feels like a poem, right?
And I
Um,
think oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
interrupt.
go ahead, go ahead.
The other thing I on top of that I love too is the way he dissects words, not just, the Spanish words and their roots and Chinese and I and in going, we start off with this story about the grandfather's store,
Mhm.
and then it keeps going, and then we end with like a thing about a dissection about words
Yep.
but how important, and then you're like, well, why, part of me like, that's interesting, but then I understand, and as I would continue reading, it's you know
Mhm.
it's it's this importance of how words too are important to these mythologies, to these stories, how we
Yeah.
when you're sitting around the table and you're hearing my auntie Polly always used the word quacha constantly, quacha, 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 which means chicken poop. I mean, I'm not using any other word. And so, as a kid, that word was constantly flung around by her. And once in a while I'd hear an elder say that word more recently, and I'd be like, oh, that's interesting, because you just don't hear people use it very often anymore. Um,
Yeah.
just, I don't know, chisme, the poem that he ends with dissecting the word chisme, and
Yeah.
things like that. I just thought were so brilliant and
Yeah.
well,
Yeah, yeah. And I think also when you grow up in multiple worlds, right? Like you you understand language in such a different way because it all kind of swirls in your head and you can't separate the words, and they blend into each other, and your appreciation for a language, and not just the maybe like different grammar could be interesting and etymologies and blah blah blah, but also the weight of the words, like the not the content, but the what's the word I'm looking for? It's what happens when you have too many languages in your head. Um, um, but the like the 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 meaning of the word, but the way that it's used in a specific context. You know what I mean? Like the example that you gave about your aunt, right? Like it's not just the word and its meaning, but it's also who used it and
mhm.
when, and then what happens when you hear other people use it, and how it all just gets jumbled up and it all just lives in you too. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I really love that he managed to bring in the Chinese and the Spanish together because um, I I can't help but like when I see uh folks who know Spanish and they incorporate Spanish into their writings. Or I always think of Gloria and Zaldula, and I probably said her name wrong. And did I say that right? And Zaldula? Yeah. Okay, great. Um, and I always think of her, but then to see like Chinese, I'm like, yes, that's so good because that's just as much a part of him,
Right.
and it should all come together, right? And in this, beautiful book of poetry. Yeah.
Well, and it's a great reminder too, because of our history. I used to, I'm loving this fact that we can have a bit of a focus or tension on Arizona writers or Arizona poets. I know it wasn't that long ago for me where I think I used to get kind of a little, jealous of uh, um, Mexican American Chicano writers from New Mexico, for instance, where
Mm-hmm.
I felt like they just had like their roots were so much more
Deep.
deeper than in Arizona. And with Arizona, I feel like for us sometimes it's stories of displacement or movement or
Mm-hmm.
there's like a or there rarely do we at least from my perspective it's there's I think that takes a big leap sometimes that instead of necessarily feeling rooted but then you have people like Alberto Rios with his border stories and where it's obviously very rooted there and but I love this I love this seeing these works that maybe prove me wrong or maybe help me heal me in a sense, make me feel better about, that the stories are there, that we are rooted, that it's not it's not always about feeling displaced or shuffled around.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think I think also that plays into Arizona's history as being such a, I mean, state 48, right? Like, I mean, the last state to be admitted to the Union in the contiguous United States. And
Mhm.
I think because it has a long history, but I think that really plays into the difficulty of creating maybe a literary community, you
Mhm.
know, and feeling a sense of rootedness. And I'm a transplant to Arizona, and it's so funny because I meet people, and I'm like, "Oh, where are you from?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm from, let's say like California." And I'm like, "Oh, when did you move here?" Like, "Oh, when I was like 2 years old." I'm like, "Okay, so you're in Arizona?" And they're like, "No, no, no, but I'm a Californian." And I'm like, I don't understand. Like, do you have to be born here to be in Arizona? And I keep hearing that, and I think it's very much connected to folks who have been here for maybe a generation plus, that they're very protective of Arizona history, and we all contribute to the culture of our state and our city or town, no matter how big or small it is.
But you're
Yeah.
right. I think that's hysterical what you just said about us being a people who everyone knows their history or everyone's a historian.
Yeah.
And I've had that experience when I've had to go to other places or just obviously in Tucson itself, um, that there's a lot of truth to that, where someone feels like they've got the real story or they've here's
Yeah.
the real history here. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
especially if there are multiple generations in. I remember a while back when during my reporter days, and I was just doing it wasn't a big piece, but I was down at the El Rio Neighborhood Center and there was a senior meals program there. And I was talking with this older gentleman who was recounting his youth growing up on the west side of town. And he talking about the Santa Cruz River when it had
Mm.
water, and and swimming and walking up a mountain. But the big thing he brought up, and I thought about this obviously with Brandon's book, was the Chinese grocery stores. And
Mm-hmm.
I think he was like, listen, it was very serious. Listen, we would have starved if it wasn't for the Chinese grocery stores.
Oh,
Meaning, Mexicans would have starved without the
yeah.
stores. And I'm like, well, tell me, what do you mean? But and I got what he meant, because I know my mom's own stories about the importance of the Chinese grocery stores to them, as well as the people who own them becoming
Yes.
friends of the family, or um and and there was they were part of, so integral to the community. They took credit. You didn't have to pay for, you didn't have to have cash right away to pay for your
Right.
groceries.
Right.
They took credit, and you could send your kid. My mom used to get sent to go get things all the time, and you didn't have to worry about them not having in cash in their pocket to go get some milk or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, it means how blessed we were in a way. This guy was really talking about that we had these people who came into came into our lives, and anyway, I remember thinking about that quite a bit with
Yeah.
Brandon, uh, grandfather, and the grocery store, um, and how important it was to Tucson, at least in our barrios.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 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 And I think, there are some really great books that talk about the history of how how different um, um, groups of people supported each other and helped
Mhm,
each other out and really built. I mean, I don't think people think of Chinese people in Tucson, right? Like
mhm,
that's not something that people think about, but
mhm,
it's a fact of history, right?
mhm, mhm,
And yeah, if I'm just going to shamelessly plug really quickly for listeners about Reading Arizona. There are some great books on there. It's a free ebook in the audio platform for anybody who resides in Arizona. And Tripas will be on there come October-ish. So you can wait to read it there or get it from your local public library or buy it. But there are books about the history of Chinese folks and different Latin communities, Mexican communities all over Arizona on Reading Arizona for free that people can access. And it's really important that we all um, learn about these different communities, right? And how
mhm,
they change and grow and because that's part of everybody's history. We're all impacted by it, right? Like,
mhm.
you're I mean, I think about like my favorite Chinese restaurant down the street from where I live and I'm like, I wish I knew your guys' story. Like, um and I think to bring it back to Brandon's poetry, it's just such a good reminder about the diversity. Um,
Yeah, for sure. I also think it's a good reminder sometimes, because I think the whole thing of people being, there's multiple generations, and we tend to, like, I think, get so caught up in thinking that that's just so important. But what happens, I think, in that case, though, is that we neglect the new generations that have come into Tucson, have come into Arizona, Phoenix, wherever, and and I don't think sometimes we've done a good enough job of forging relationships. There are
mm,
groups who do that and have been great at that, but we ourselves are not necessarily good about rolling out the welcome mat, to new immigrants that come here, that are
mhm.
going to, in several generations, be able to sit in conversation with another National Book Award nominee, and or talk about their book, how it relates to Arizona. But that's one thing I think about, that I regret, is that if there's anything that we can do, is that we don't we're not we're so sometimes so locked into this thing of
Yeah.
protecting, or that this history, which it's important, yes,
Yeah.
but I think sometimes it's also been limiting in terms of
Mhm.
not welcoming, not being welcoming enough to new immigrants, to
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. Are there maybe groups or organizations that you'd recommend following, or for people who maybe they know someone, or because what comes to my mind is the Poetry Center at the University of Arizona, which I get their newsletters. I think they're fantastic. They're always showcasing up and coming poets and also like people who are already established poets, and it's a beautiful way to just kind of have a sense of what's happening in the poetry land. But do you have any
Yeah, no,
recommendations?
I mean, that's a good question. I always recommend the Poetry Center too, and I love their newsletter as
Oh,
well. It's one newsletter I always tend to open right away when I
yeah,
see it on in my email.
absolutely.
Um, there used to be organizations that I would say now I would probably look at the folk, um, not the folk festival, but the Tucson Meet Yourself, and the
Oh,
group that supports their work. I think that they probably are the one organization, at least in this area in Southern Arizona, that does a really good job of welcoming new people and celebrating old, and also just reminding us of the importance of telling stories that and storytelling of people who are folk artists, writers, anyone who's kind of made an impression to indigenous communities as well.
yeah,
um, but yeah, that's probably who I'd recommend. But Poetry Center, yeah, always
yeah,
good people.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, it was
Um,
wonderful talking with you,
you
Yam, and
too.
Brandon. I hope we've done a good justice on Brandon's work. I think that
You too.
it's just um, it is beautiful. It is beautiful, beautiful work of telling Arizona stories and telling his
Yeah.
family stories. And I'm grateful that he was able to get it published.
Me too. Me too. It was a wonderful insight into just a family's stories and intricacies and inspiring too, for a first generation American, to be like, oh yeah, like it's amazing these similarities, like, doesn't matter where your family's from, like there are these things, and it's wonderful. So would recommend for everybody. Absolutely.
For sure.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you for tuning into the Arizona Center for the Book's Southwest Book Chats. These conversations may have inspired you to explore the beauty of Arizona, cultivate beauty in your own backyard, or seek diverse Arizona stories. Our state has a rich literary heritage that can be explored through your local library's online and in-person services. This project is supported by the Arizona State Library, Archives and Public Records, a division of the Arizona Secretary of State, with federal funds from the Institute of Museum and Library Services.